Okie dokie, it is live. Hey everyone, how's it going? Azren, the language nerd here, as per usual. And we have a guest today who is
Katie from
Katie.
Dove Languages.
Yeah, well, we've had Katie on before. We did a 5-minute language chat, which I find tends to be how I generally bring people on for the first time, and then we will do something longer later. It's generally how it tends to happen, I find. And so today we're going to be talking to Katie about language-related things, her life, and a whole bunch of things in between that as well. So I guess a good place to start. I just want to take it all the way back. So Katie, let's just start. Where are you from, and where are you born?
I was born close to London, but I grew up in the north of England, close to Sheffield.
Sheffield. Okay. Now I've heard, and I don't know if this is true, but one thing I've heard is that when you go to England, every region has like its own, I guess you could say like little like different accent and dialect, and it's very noticeable. Is that true?
So there certainly are different accents. I have a northern accent. I have a slight Sheffield accent. And they're certainly different, even cities that are close together. So for example, Leeds, which is like a 40-minute drive from Sheffield, has a totally different accent to the Sheffield accent. And Manchester, which is about an hour's drive, has a different accent. So it is different, and there's different words as well. But I think compared to other countries, the difference isn't so big.
Interesting.
So for example, in Italy, where I live now, I guess they're officially called dialects. So the way of speaking in the different areas, but they're linguistically speaking, they're different languages. So for example, somebody from Milan who speaks the Milanese dialect wouldn't understand somebody from Sicily who speaks the Sicilian dialect.
And in England, they're not that different. Like they're different.
No, not at all.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's something that's always interested me, right? Because in Canada, like I could go. I'm in the more on the western side. If I go to, for example, Ontario, which is probably a 4-hour flight east. Roughly 4-hour flight. Whoop, phone's ringing. There we go. Roughly a 4-hour flight east. I mean, yeah, there might be a slight accent difference on some people, but overall, it's generally speaking in Canada, the accents are, I mean, unless you're in very rural areas, but they're relatively speaking, not overly different, and it's such a huge country. But then you go, for example, to England, and you're saying you can literally drive an hour, and you can tell that, oh, it's not so different, you don't understand, but you can tell. Like that's just fascinating.
Yeah, even smaller than that, actually. If I think, so for example, where I live is 8 miles away from Sheffield, and the accent and the dialect in my town is different to the accent and the dialect in Sheffield. And if you drive 20 minutes south, there's another different accent and a dialect. So yeah, I guess that's true. You can always understand each other, so they're not so different compared to other places like Spain and Italy. But at the same time, for the short distance that there are between the places, it's interesting because it's completely different.
Why is that? Is it is it because of way back in history people came from different places, or why? How did that happen?
I'm not sure, actually. I think maybe an interesting question could be, why does it happen in some places and why doesn't it happen in other places? So maybe, why is that not the case in Canada? Because I guess I can imagine it just happening so, if there's a new slang word or someone invents a new word and then they speak to 10 people and then those 10 people start using it, and then those 10 people speak to another 10 people, so then 100 people start using it. So I can see how it would happen easily, because you get these little communities who all speak together, and then that kind of creates an accent and a dialect. But it's interesting then that it doesn't happen in other places.
So you said you're born in London, you said? Is that right?
Close to London.
Close to London, okay. So if you go back to London, I guess when you were in London, how long did you spend there?
So I don't actually remember living in London because I moved up north when I was about 1.
Okay.
I've lived in London. I've lived in London since then, twice as an adult, but I didn't really grow up in London. I definitely grew up in Sheffield or close to Sheffield.
So I'm curious as to when you're, for example, what is it, Sheffield, you said?
Yeah.
So I guess I'm curious, when you're in Sheffield compared to London, I guess part one, do you find that your accent or the way you talk, or even like your behavior, because I assume there's different, maybe not, but I assume there's like semi-different, small different cultural differences between somewhere close to London versus Sheffield. I'm assuming, correct me if I'm wrong, but
yeah, absolutely.
Like, do you find your accent and or behavior changes? And part two, what is your default way of speaking then, would you say?
Well, it's moving, kind of going between London and Sheffield has been quite interesting for me and my sister, because so my sister lives in London now, but our parents don't come from Sheffield. So we have a slight northern accent, but not a very strong one.
Where are your parents from?
And so my dad is from London and my mum is from Liverpool.
Okay.
So we've always had this thing where in Sheffield, everybody thought we were kind of posh because we didn't have very strong regional accents. And then in London, everybody thinks we're northerners. Like,
interesting.
So we even before I moved to Italy and started living in different countries and adopting different cultures, I've always had this thing where I've always been slightly different to the places where I lived. So people, people have always heard my accent when I was younger and said, "Oh, where are you from?" So that it happens in Italy, but it also happened in Sheffield when I was growing up as well.
Yeah. So I guess, did that lead to was it like when you were growing up, and I guess you moved back and forth a couple of times, like you lived in London, we also grew up in Sheffield. Like what was when were you in London, when were you in Sheffield? What's the story behind that?
So I moved to London for a year when I was 18. Didn't like it because it was very big and difficult to make friends. I think maybe I wasn't ready when I was 18.
How big is it in comparison to London?
I don't know in terms of population, actually. It's a big city, but it's a lot smaller than London.
Okay.
And so, yeah, London felt kind of big and scary and I didn't like it. So I moved back up to Sheffield. And then after I'd been living in Italy for about 4 or 5 years, I think I moved to London for a year to do a master's. So this was 2 or 3 years ago. And the same thing, even several years later, I just found it too big. I didn't really enjoy living there. So after a year,
well, it's funny. I just did a quick Google search. I did a Google search as you're talking about the population differences. It seems like, according to just a quick Google search, Sheffield has about 575,000 people in mid-2016, according to your government website, sheffield.gov.uk. And then there's a bunch of stuff after that. But in London, you have like 8.788 million in 2016.
Yeah, so there's a big difference.
Yeah, so it's like a really big difference, I guess. Yeah. It's not surprising. Like if you go from it's so different living in a small place versus something that's so huge, especially London. Like it's got such a reputation around the world, and it's it's not like any old big city.
Yeah, and I love London now. I really, really enjoyed living there for a year. I think it's so diverse. There's so many different languages as well. It's a really interesting place to live. But for me, when I live somewhere, I have to be able to live in a situation where I can ring my friends on a Sunday morning and say, "Oh, do you want to meet for lunch?" So a city that's the size where you can still make reasonably spontaneous plans, and you can.
And why would being somewhere like London stop you from doing something like that?
Because often, so when I was living in London, for example, my sister, it took me sometimes an hour and a half to get to my sister's house.
Holy! And by car, by train, by how?
By public transport, because it's not practical to have a car in London. So most people don't have cars; they get around by public transport. And yes, same with other friends as well. You know, it would take. We had friends who lived half an hour away from us, and that they were the people who live around the corner from us.
Really interesting.
Yeah.
That's so crazy. So, and so where are you in Italy now?
In Milan.
In Milan. Okay.
Which is perfect size for me, actually, because it's big enough where there's lots of things going on still, but it's the right size where you can get to the other side of the city in half an hour, and you can ring people and after work and say, oh, let's meet for a beer, and you can organize plans about half an hour before, which is, I've realized since living in London that I really need that.
It seems like you're a bit of a nomad. Like you've lived in a couple different places, you've gone back and forth, and now you're in Italy. Like it seems like you almost, it seems like you kind of like there's a small nomad inside of you.
Well, I've moved around quite a lot, but always between England and Italy. So I've never lived in a country that's not England or Italy. But I've done a lot of back and forth. So I've lived in a couple of different places in Italy and a couple of different places in the UK as well.
And why like those two countries?
So I did study abroad in Italy in a small town called Ferrara in the northeast, close to Bologna. I did that longer ago than I care to remember, about 10 years ago, I think. And since then, well, I really, really loved Italy. I really enjoyed living in Italy. And I made lots of friends here as well. So sometimes I get really tempted to move somewhere else. I'd love to live in France for a little while, or maybe in Spain for a little while. But after a while, you get to, I feel like if having a nomad life is really exciting, you know, so you get to go and see lots of different places. But at the same time, I've realized every time I move to a new city or a new country, you make a new group of friends, and then you move somewhere else and you make a new group of friends. And after a while, it just ends up, you've got loads and loads of friends, which is great, but it kind of, everything's a bit diluted.
Yeah, and it almost becomes like a full-time job to maintain it. Like it's, I don't know if you've had this experience, but it's like I travel a fair bit. Usually every year I'll travel. I try to travel to a new country every year, or travel back to somewhere I've been to, depending on the year. But it's crazy because for example, when I was in Chile, I was visiting a friend of mine, and I loved it. It was so cool. Like there's different regions I wanted to visit, but didn't have time to. There's things I wanted to do and whatnot. And I told him like, yeah, I'm definitely coming back. I just don't know when. And then when I was in China was a different example because I actually went there twice, but still I was like, man, I definitely want to come back. I just don't know what it's going to be. You know, and every time I go somewhere, it's always like, I'm definitely going back. And I don't know where it's going to be. But it's crazy because there's so many places you want to go to that sometimes you're like, man, I actually don't know if I will get around to going back to every single place. And even if I do, it's going to be like once in the rest of my life or something like that. Because there's just so much, and there's only so much time you have to go everywhere. And then it's also money, right? It's not just...
Yeah, definitely. And I think, you know, there's a lot of value in traveling around, and I really respect people. I know a few digital nomads, and I think it looks like an amazing lifestyle. But at the same time, I feel like for me, I like building up relationships with the country and a language as well. So, and I think that the longer, you know, the more time you spend there, the deeper the relationship can be, the better you learn to speak the language, and the more rewarding it is. Whereas I feel like if I lived in a different place every year, it would be really, really fun, but I wouldn't. Maybe
you don't get to go deep. You don't need to go deep. You don't get to go deep anywhere. it's kind of like, and maybe I'm wrong, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's kind of like when you're talking, it's reminding me of like when you're in high school, or if you're like the popular kid in high school where you know everyone, but you don't really have any friends.
Absolutely, yeah. It could be like that with languages too, and countries.
Yep, that's totally. Yeah, it's totally true. I remember I've met a few different people that travel a lot. Like I remember I met this one girl, and she was at the time probably a little older than me at the time. I think she was probably in her late 20s, maybe. I don't remember, mid to late 20s. And she'd been to like 110 countries across the world. And I was like, holy cow, that's like that's a lot of places, like 110. But to be able to do that at such a young age, like it was just fascinating to hear like the lifestyle she had to lead, like that she had to lead, because she would like work back in her home country, save all of her money, and then spend it on traveling, and then just be in like 1 week one country, 1 week another, and then always moving, and then back to her own country, save, spend it all on traveling, save, spend it all on traveling, and it's always like no home base, switching and going around, and I don't know, like that's just not, personally, it's not my style. Like,
Yeah.
not at all.
Yeah, I think there's always a trade-off.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the more things that you want to experience, the more languages you want to learn, the more countries you want to go to, the less time you can dedicate to each thing. So it's about finding a balance, I think.
Totally. What do you speak again, language-wise?
So I speak Italian, French, Spanish. I'm back to working on Mandarin Chinese. Again, now I wouldn't say that I speak it. I can have basic conversations. And a long time ago, I could have basic conversations in German. My German's quite rusty now, but I'd like to pick that up again at some point as well.
Got it. So Italian, French, English, obviously, some Mandarin, some German, and did I miss anything?
Spanish.
Oh, and Spanish. Okay. So in Italian, French, Spanish, and English, are you relatively comfortable?
Yeah. I'd say in order, it would be kind of Italian, then French, then Spanish.
Italian, French, and Spanish. Okay.
Yeah, it's roughly, I think. So I've done the C2 exam in Italian, C1 exam in French, and I would estimate that I'm roughly around B2 level in Spanish.
Okay.
So yeah, that's with the common European frameworks, just for if somebody's watching or listening and they haven't heard of those random numbers and letters before. But so that would kind of be advanced for Spanish, getting to advanced for French, and then like upper intermediate for Spanish. Sorry, did I say Spanish? I meant Italian. Sorry.
Italian. Okay. Oh, yeah. So you're okay. Got it. I see.
Yeah. So it's Italian advanced.
Yeah.
Close-ish to advanced-ish for French, and then upper intermediate for Spanish.
So do you have to be like a genius to be able to do that? Like, what's the story there?
Definitely not. I'm not a genius, unfortunately. So I think it definitely helps that they're all quite similar as well. So once you speak one Romance language, all of the other Romance languages become easier. I'm sure you will have experienced this as well with French and Spanish, perhaps. Mm-hmm.
And I know personally, I'm curious if this happened for you as well. I studied French first, and I've studied French. I've spoken French almost as long as I've spoken English, which is my first language, because I went to a French school ever since I've been in school. So I've always done my education from college, kindergarten all the way to grade 12. It was always, French schooling, mostly French schooling. Some classes were in English, but majority are in French. Even in university, I majored in French and Spanish. But I found that I started studying Spanish would have been 9 years ago. I started studying French about 20 years ago. So I have a lot more experience in French, and yet Spanish has always come a heck of a lot more naturally to me, and it's felt a lot easier. It's always felt, not always, but usually, often it feels more natural to me to speak in Spanish, even though I'm equally comfortable in both. Yeah, I'm good in both, no problem in both. But my brain will find it 1% easier, 2% easier to go into Spanish, even though I've studied it for half the time. Yeah,
that's interesting. I think sometimes you find a language that you just click with. So for me, I think that's interesting, because I've had a similar-ish experience with French and Italian. So I'm certainly not, I don't speak Italian like a native speaker. I'm certainly still a learner. but I've been speaking it for years and years and years, and all of my social life, my love life, everything. I live in Milan, so most of my life outside of work is in Italian. My French is a lower level than Italian, but for some reason, I prefer speaking French. I don't know why. I just feel more of an affinity with the language compared to Italian.
And how long have you spoken Italian compared to French?
So I've been speaking Italian for about 10 years. And French, that's a difficult question because I've been learning it very on and off.
Okay. On and off for how long?
Yeah, definitely. But yeah, no, it's really hard to. I think I started learning it probably about 6 or 7 years ago. And I spent kind of 2 years just learning it very, very much as a hobby, not really practicing speaking it with anyone. So just listening to podcasts and studying. Yeah, just doing it independently in my free time.
Got it.
And then I dropped it completely for a couple of years. And then since then, I've been picking up for a little bit and then dropping it. But I'd say for the last year or so, I've picked it up more seriously again.
Interesting. What appeals to you more about French than Italian?
I think part of the difference, which could be, I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, but this could also be part of the reason that you feel comfortable speaking Spanish, perhaps, is that for me with French, in a lot of ways, I can identify more with the French culture. And I think even small things like, so if I go to France, now in Milan, if I go to a restaurant, even before I open my mouth, so nothing to do with language skills, I walk in and people start speaking to me in English and they give me an English menu. Because it's...
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Because I just don't look Italian. So, and I feel it's really, really hard for me to integrate into the culture here because just looks-wise, every time I could just say 2 words and people will say like, oh, where are you from? And then they immediately kind of force me into this conversation that is essentially, it's nice, it's just curiosity, but the first conversation I always have with any Italian here is like, hey, you're different. Tell me about where you're from. Tell me about all the things that are different about you compared to the Italians. So after a while, that kind of becomes quite hard.
It must give you like an extra 2 points on like the attractiveness scale though, right? I imagine, probably.
Well, yeah, there's positives and negatives.
Nice.
But yeah, it's really hard to kind of, like, I could never be a spy here. Let's just put it that way.
Fair enough.
Whereas in France, when I go to France, I feel like it's like a relief because I just walk into places and people immediately start speaking French to me because I could be French, just looks-wise. And I think that helps me to connect with the culture a lot more. And also, maybe in terms of just really basic stuff like how people interact with each other, what people do, the French culture is more similar to the British culture, I think, compared to Italian culture. So sometimes I feel more at home with French culture.
Right. How is it similar? Like, what are some different aspects of, let's say, French culture that feel more homely for you?
So I could start with the small things. French people aren't afraid of butter.
Okay. Butter's
bigger things.
It's the opposite of money, right? Like more money, more problems, they say. Well, it's not, I mean, I guess technically more butter, more problems actually.
Yeah, definitely. Kind of relationship-wise as well, French people, I think, are generally a bit more similar to English people. It's not necessarily, it's not good or bad, it's just different. So things like Italian people are super, super sociable and friendly, which is amazing. And I would love to be like that as well. And I try. Sometimes there are some parts of my culture that are you know, like in England, for example, if people in England, we don't have as much the culture to like knock on a neighbor's door and then stay there for like 4 hours. Whereas in Italian culture, they have that, which is amazing. I love it. But it's difficult for me to adapt to sometimes. Whereas when I'm around, I have French friends in Milan, and we just have, in terms of social codes, it's more similar.
In France or in?
Between, so when I'm interacting with French people compared to when I'm interacting with Italian people. And to be honest, I think I prefer the Italian way. I think the Italian way is amazing, but sometimes it can be quite difficult to adapt to if you don't have that culture.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel like you are like an actress sometimes when you're in a different, like you almost like need to act a certain way, even though your preference would be to act a different way?
I guess, yeah, so that question is interesting, and probably I feel more like that when I'm interacting with Italians than when I'm interacting with French people, if that makes sense. Because so there's lots of things about the Italian culture that I love and I want to adapt, I want to adopt, but it is difficult because it's so different to my culture. So I do try to act because I want to integrate really well and to
become a part of it in a lot of ways.
Yeah, absolutely. But it requires more effort, definitely, and possibly a bit of acting as well.
Yeah, and I don't think it's necessarily like I don't, in my perspective, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to be an actor, quote unquote actor, actress. When you're abroad. And as a matter of fact, I actually, and this is I'd say I'm pretty, this isn't something I put a lot of thought into, so I might go back and be like, I'm not sure if I fully believe that, but the thought that comes to mind right now is that I almost feel like for you to fully enjoy being in another country long term, you do need to a part of you needs to almost go, okay, even though I'm used to things being one way, things here are another way. And so I'm going to now, yes, I am, in your case, British, or whatever your background is, doesn't matter for anyone, right? French, Spanish, British, Chinese, Japanese, whatever. Yes, I come from this place, and yes, these are my core values, etc. And I'm not going to lose them because I don't think you should be expected to. But you also have to understand that, okay, now I'm in this place, I'm living here, I'm living in Italy, I'm living in France, I'm in England. So I need to actually adopt, and like I might have to act at first, but really learn how these values work so that you can. I mean, I don't think you'd be very happy otherwise. Maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because otherwise you end up kind of living in like a little bubble, and I think it's already hard enough not to do that, particularly if you're a native, if English is your native language. It's very difficult. You have to kind of fight your way out of the English bubble wherever you go because everybody wants to speak in English with you, and everybody, like I was saying before, when you first meet people are like, oh wow, you're English, and then talk to you about England all the time. So it's quite difficult to get out of that bubble as it is. So I think, yeah, if you didn't do that, and if you didn't try and adopt the culture and act a little bit, I guess, then you wouldn't have the full experience of living in the country, and it wouldn't be as worthwhile, I don't think.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's interesting what you said about acting, because when it comes to languages, that extends to body language, which we've talked about before, and accent as well. I think you kind of have to like imagine, okay, now I'm an Italian person, or now I'm a French person, to really try and fit in.
Yeah. Do you do that, do you find? Like, is that something you're doing? Like when you're in Italy, you're like almost telling yourself, I'm Italian, I'm French, I'm...
I don't think I do it explicitly, like in my head. I don't say, oh, I'm Italian, but I certainly try to... I think it's partly human nature as well, I guess. Like, I don't know if you've had that even in your first language, if you live somewhere where there's a different accent for a while, you start to pick it up a little bit.
For
Or
sure.
friends who, or maybe friends or even like people in a couple, after a while, you know, maybe they start to kind of get more similar, so they talk in a similar way. And people that you spend a lot of time with, I think you start to adopt their body language and the way they speak a little bit. And so that happens to me naturally, I think, when I learn the other languages.
Yeah, it's interesting actually. Something just occurred to me right now. So you're more fluent in Italian, less fluent in French, yet you prefer speaking French because you like the culture more. So it's interesting that, or that not that you like the culture more. Yes, I shouldn't say like that, but that you feel that's more similar to your own, like to English culture, to British culture.
Yeah, yeah,
sorry, yeah, right. So it's interesting that you like it's. I almost wonder what the connection, because I'm the similar way in a lot of senses, that if I align with, if I align with the culture, if it feels more at home or whatever it is, there seems to be a connection between how much how much you enjoy speaking a language, or how naturally a language comes to you compared to how naturally you feel with people of that cultural background.
Yeah, yeah.
It's something I've never thought about, and it would be interesting if I was someone who's more into like research and like formal research and science and everything. I would be very fascinated to read studies on that or to do studies on that.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm just trying to think if I've ever come across or seen any study about that. So in terms of like how connected you feel to a culture, or how positive you feel about a culture that's associated with a language, and whether that affects how you. I imagine there probably might. There has to be
something on it. There has to be, absolutely.
After the interview.
Yeah, it's crazy because so for example, I have lived in France for a chunk of time. So places I've spent a good amount of time, it would be France, China, Peru, and Canada, obviously. And I'd say those are like the 4 places I've spent more than just a month, right? And it's actually quite interesting, right? Because, you know, every single country obviously has a different culture, but one thing that fascinates me is just around behavior, right? Like behavior and I think physical appearance as well. So, you know, I'll give you some example, like behavioral examples. In India, when I was there, lateness is totally fine. Being flaky, being like unreliable, generally speaking, totally fine. Like not completely totally fine, but it's more socially acceptable than maybe in Canada, where it'd be completely, if I blew you off an hour before, it would be like, oh, what? I made plans around it. But there, like, it's all the time, like, hey, can we actually meet tomorrow? It'd be like, oh, yeah, sure, whatever. It doesn't matter. Right? France, I feel like it's more of a, I've always struggled to find the right word, but almost more proper. Like you need to, like generally people dress better than maybe here in Canada. Generally people, there's more standards around being maybe more polite, maybe more, almost more sophisticated. I'm not sure if that's the right word. It's just interesting. So have you noticed anything like that as you've traveled around?
Yeah, I think there's definitely that difference between, I think in that respect, the UK is more similar to Canada and America, whereas France and Italy are more similar. People are more formal, I guess. Like there's this thing in Italian called bella figura, which is literally like beautiful figure, but and I guess it kind of means image. So fare una bella figura is like to make a good impression, but it's, you know, people talk about it more. Everyone knows what it means. It's an important part of society, and I think that's kind of similar in France as well.
Mm-hmm. And I think every country, maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like every country has like 1, 2, 3, 4, like I don't know what the number is, but a very short list of core values. And usually they really could be summed up in 1 word, 2 words. Like they really could, like, and it's almost like you need to become that value in a lot of ways, or to almost inhale that or absorb that value.
Yeah.
It's true though. It's really a big thing. Like China, modesty is a big one, right? Like,
Yeah.
And that can be interpreted in many ways, as directions you can go with it, but it's like modesty, it's about humbleness, right? It's way more about that. That's a big part of their culture, right? Like Latin America, South America, way more about, I haven't found like a word that matches, but they're way more like warm might be the word, warm, welcoming, right? Emotional, more that, and emotional, not like, not like emo, but just more emotion in their lives, right? Canada is more like very polite, right? Very, very polite kind of thing. Like there's different core values in every single place.
Yeah.
And I feel like one thing that opens up, like, and I'm curious what you think, but I feel like it can almost help you be more fluent in a language if you understand what some of the core values are of the culture behind the language. And somehow that opens up way more and allows you to be more fluent in a language, I find.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think because people, there are cultural codes. So certain things people expect you to do, ways people expect you to behave. And if you don't do that, usually people are very forgiving with foreigners, of course, but even if they're very forgiving and they understand, it's something that is kind of putting a barrier between you and the people who live in the country. So, and to learn a language, the most important thing for learning a language is your relationship with native speakers. So to be able to communicate with native speakers and to have native speakers kind of accept you, not necessarily as one of them, so it doesn't have to be that strong, but let's say, so you can't really learn a language without practicing with native speakers. And the easiest way to get lots of opportunities to practice speaking the language is if native speakers feel comfortable with you.
Do you think that's true? That's really difficult or not possible to learn a language unless you practice with natives?
I mean, so there is an exception of this. If you speak to somebody who speaks the language a lot better than you do, it doesn't have to be a native speaker, I guess.
Okay, so you're of the belief that you need to communicate with a like an advanced or native or someone that's quite strong in the language to learn.
Yeah, I mean, well, so they have to be much better than you. So maybe if you're a beginner, then you can chat with someone who's been learning for a year and you can learn lots from them. But essentially, yeah, speaking with people who are better than you in the language, so you get that, so you can learn from them. So you get a model of how they speak and you can start to pick up how they speak. Yeah,
it's interesting. I don't know if that's true in my experience. Maybe. And so I should rephrase. In my personal experience, I agree with you. And I don't know. Like I think it depends on what level you want to get to. No.
So
like there's plenty of people who, for example, speak a language quite well, but the way they really learned was, for example, through watching TV. Like Friends for English is such a common thing that people have learned and like use as a way to learn. They'll listen to how people talk, they imitate it, they read, they go, oh, that's what people say, and then they, I don't know, like, and I could be wrong. Like, I don't know. I actually don't know. It's just interesting to hear you take that position because I've never really like, I don't know. I've never thought about that being like a core pillar of being able to learn a language.
So I think I've forgotten the name of the diagram now. You know that diagram that has like the two circles that overlap, and the
Venn diagram.
Is it the Venn diagram?
That's what it's called. Like the yeah.
So for me, I think you can actually. I'm certainly not one of those people who says, okay, you have to speak from day one. The only way to learn a language is speak, speak, speak. Because I completely agree with you. I think that massive input is another good way to learn a language. So lots and lots and lots of listening, lots and lots of reading. Mm-hmm. But certainly, listening to things that are a model for how you want to communicate. So that's often things like soap operas or Friends or, you know, people having normal conversations.
Mm-hmm.
And that can certainly help you with your speaking. So let's imagine we've got the two circles. So you've got the speaking circle and the listening circle, and you've got the little bit that overlaps in the middle. So I think if you listen a lot, that pours into the speaking skills, absolutely. And listening and getting lots of input and getting, you know, hearing the same structures over and over again, I think you can definitely absorb them enough to then use them yourself in conversation.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a part of the speaking circle that's not covered by just listening, I feel, at least in my experience.
Right. Yeah, and I actually don't know, to be honest. I don't know the answer. And I probably, if we'd spoken about, we're in what, May? So if we'd spoken about 10 months ago, I probably would have been like, yeah, absolutely. I think that's true. Until there's one specific person I met, and then it made me think about it and do more research on it. It was someone I met, and he had never actually had a conversation with someone in French. He'd never spoken with someone in his life. All he'd ever done was read textbooks, listen to different audio programs. He would talk to himself. So he would be like, bonjour. Oui, bonjour. Comment ça va? Ah oui, ça va très bien. Et toi? Oui, ça va. Like, while he was in a shower or driving or whenever he had time, like a lot of conversation with himself. He would repeat audio, and that was like his core base. And then we met, and the first, I think, I could be mistaken. No, I'm not mistaken. His first time, if not one of his first times ever having a conversation in French, was with me. And I was baffled. I was like, wow, this guy he spoke quite well. Like, not perfect, obviously, but he's quite strong. And I was like, how did you learn? And he said, oh, I listened to stuff. And then we had a really deep conversation one day about, I was like, wait, so you told me the first day we met that you only learn by listening and reading and stuff, but you speak so well. Wait, have you never spoken? He's like, no. I was like, what? He's like, maybe 5 minutes here, 10 minutes, like not with another person. I was like, it's just so crazy. And I think it's a minority. I think it's an outlier situation where someone speaks really well, but has done zero speaking. I don't think that's I don't think you can just open your door and be like, ha, someone's there. Wow, they're like that. But it was interesting.
Yeah, I think the speaking to yourself can certainly help as well, because then you're almost getting everything. So you're not getting the interaction between two people, but you're getting all of the input from all of the listening, and then you're practicing the output as well. So I think if you have ways to practice output without a native speaker, then that can certainly help you to build your speaking skills. But you need some kind of output.
Yeah. I almost wonder if you need I almost wonder if you need, whether it's a real physical person or real physical people that you're talking to, or if you've listened to something long, like let's say you watched all 10 seasons, 12 seasons, whatever, Friends, right? And you've heard Joey Tribbiani talk episode after episode after episode after episode, and you've heard him and seen him in so many different scenarios, plus all the other people, that you could almost imagine having that person to talk to. So even if you are talking to yourself, you might have this imaginary person in your brain that actually talks something like a native speaker, which almost can replace the real person. Like, I almost wonder if if it's almost like you need to have conversations with someone, real or fake.
It could be fake, but because I think, for example, my experience, and also my partner Mateo, who is Italian, and he's been kind of learning English. He hates studying. So I tried to get him to do an italki lesson once, and he did one and never did it again. His only way of learning English is by doing things he likes. Can't persuade him to do anything else. But that kind of works actually, because he does so much listening. He probably listens to English for about 4 hours a day. He listens to podcasts while he's working. And so no output, massive input, no output. Maybe he gets speaking practice probably for a couple of weeks a year, maybe when he meets up with my friends or meets up with my family. And his speaking is a bit rusty. So it's amazing how much, because we lived in London for a year. So when we lived in London, he got lots of speaking practice then, of course. Since then, it's been 3 years since we haven't lived in London, and he has no output. It's amazing how much he hasn't lost. So I think listening, that shows me the power of listening and the power of massive input. That it's helped him to maintain it really well. But when he speaks, there is I feel like there is something missing a little bit, that to get that extra, to get to that higher level of fluency and that level of being comfortable when he speaks, he would need to do more output during the year.
Right.
Similar for me with French, or even also with the Italian when I was in London. But French, there've been times when I haven't spoken hardly any French, but I've watched loads of French TV, and that's really, really helped me maintain my French way better than I would have imagined. But when I start to speak it, I have a while, maybe even for the whole first lesson, when I'm picking up lessons with my conversation tutor. It takes me a while to get back into speaking. I kind of feel like I've got a sock in my mouth for a while.
Yeah, totally.
But that's no output. Maybe if Mateo and Mateo for English and me for French, maybe if we'd had a way to use output as well, so speaking to ourselves or making videos or whatever, that could have solved that problem.
And I almost think and this is one of the things I've always been fascinated by, is that, and this is with languages, this is I find with not just languages, but a lot of just so many different things in life, that there's so much strong research that backs up so many opposing and different viewpoints.
Yeah.
And there's so many personal experiences of research saying one thing, and then these group of people being well, wait a second, I didn't do that. I just did blah, 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 blah. And it worked really well. There's so many options. And I think for me, I wonder if it just comes down to self-awareness about you, and just testing different things and being yeah, theoretically speaking, this is what, it should be like. But, for whatever reason, I don't know why, this is working for me.
Yeah. And to be honest, I mean, linguistics is one of those topics that I don't know so much for other academic areas, but I did linguistics for my my degree and my master's, and there is just so much arguing. So yes. Really,
oh my God.
I'm fascinated by how adults learn a second language. So that's something that I specialized in throughout my degree and my master's. And it's just, it gets really, really, really bitchy. And there are no answers yet. Apart from, when it comes to phonetics, so accents and sounds, there's more research that backs up specific theories. So you can kind of say, okay, so there are 20 years of research, we know this happens. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to learning grammar, for example, people are still arguing about the same stuff that they were arguing about 30 years ago. So it's difficult to lean on research to get an answer for the best way to learn a language.
Interesting. So that's something I've never, I've studied a decent, I've never gotten a major in linguistics, but I've studied a decent amount of linguistics. And I've definitely noticed a lot of the debates and arguments, but I've never thought of that in the sense that, maybe research, relying entirely on research is not necessarily not necessarily a thing that's going to lead you to the quote unquote best path, because there are so many conflicting thoughts, beliefs, etc. Yeah,
definitely. So it's certainly you have to, I think if you find something that you feel is working for you, and you have evidence that it's working for you, then then keep going with it.
Yeah. What are some of the things for, like you said, for phonetics, for example, there's a couple of things that, we have 20 years of research or whatnot that are true. Like, what are some of the phonetic truths or, the things that most people believe in phonetics?
Interestingly, the stuff, I saw you had him on the show a couple of weeks ago. So the stuff that Gabe Weiner works on.
Yep.
With his minimal pair trainers. So when babies are born, all babies are like little linguists. So they can understand all sounds in all of the world's languages.
Mm-hmm.
And then as people get older, that ability and you can see it starts to drop off, it starts to diminish even in very young children. So even kind of by the age of 2, it's starting to change a little bit. To become a more effective communicator in your native language, your brain kind of gets stuck on the sounds that are in your native language.
Okay.
So it means that the ability to, for example, if I'm born in England, well, I am, so I'm born in England. When I was born, I could have perfectly perceived the difference between like the French oo and u.
Yeah.
But then as I got older, my ability to perceive that difference drops off, which is why often when we hear a foreign accent, like sometimes it happens to me in Italian, people will say 2 words that are different and that there's a pronunciation feature that makes them different. So like, for example, pala, which means like spade, and palla, which means ball.
Mm-hmm.
When I first heard that difference, I'd be like, what? They're the same words. And that's because my ability to perceive that difference has dropped off, because it's like the use it or lose it. The brain follows a use it or lose it principle. So I was never using the ability.
Can that be reacquired?
Well, so that's where it comes in. That's where it gets interesting, because that's the research that Gabe Weiner's been using, is that it can be reacquired to a certain extent. So there's been years of research on training adults to perceive the difference in sounds that aren't important in their native language, so they've lost that ability to perceive them.
Mm-hmm.
They can be trained. I don't think there are any studies that have shown that they can perceive them exactly the same as native speakers, but a lot of studies have shown really, really, really big improvements.
Right. I almost wonder if there's a certain genetic piece to that. What I mean by that is, for example, if you take someone who's, let's use a musical example, it reminds you a lot of music. Some people are really tone deaf.
Yeah.
And they can improve. Like, you can do training with them, ear training, and you can help them, right? And they can improve, but the extent that they improve is going to be very different than someone who just has a natural musical ear. My mom's a good example. My mom is just atrociously tone deaf, has always been atrociously tone deaf her whole life. It's just one thing she's just really not great at. Like a simple exercise, like if I take, we have these bells in our house that for my sister, and there's essentially a full scale of notes. If I take, like, I don't know how much you know about music, but if I take like a middle C, right, and I go 1 octave up, or actually an octave up, so middle C and an octave higher C, essentially same note, but an octave higher, she can hear the difference. If I go like middle C and I go 2 notes down, she can't tell me which is higher, she can't tell me.
Yeah.
And like there's like, and it's so crazy, it makes you wonder if that with this ear, like to reacquire that ability, I do wonder if there's a cerebral brain element to it where some people are going to be able to find it easier to reacquire than others because of maybe DNA, maybe upbringing, like maybe they had a lot of music experience, or maybe they've had something in their lives that required them to use that part of their brain, even though it wasn't for language and for sounds, but for other type of sound type of activities. So when they go to do it for languages, it's an easier jump. I almost wonder.
Yeah, I think certainly past experiences can make a big difference. So I'm trying to think.
Excuse me.
Yeah. So I was trying to remember. I remember hearing some research, but I can't remember the specific one now. It's about Chinese people. So this is kind of the opposite, actually, I think. But native Chinese speakers are much, much, much better at perceiving tonal differences than we are, because they do it all the time.
Of course, yeah, of course.
But in music, when it comes to music, so that I think, I don't want to quote research out of context, but I think that was, maybe I can look it up and send it to you. But so they are more sensitive to tonal differences in music, and I think that
specifically in music. Interesting. Okay, I thought you meant in language. Okay,
I'll have to double check that one. But so it wouldn't surprise me if that happens the other way around too. You know, if people have experiences with music, for example, when they're younger, or experiences that help them. One thing that I think is interesting is there's also some research that shows that so babies who are adopted maintain some of the sensibility. So they're adopted. Maybe let's say there are babies that are born. I can't remember where they were in the study now. Like born in Korea.
Sure.
And then they're adopted, and then they grow up in America. So they totally lose Korean. They've never really spoken Korean. But as an adult, they learn it faster. So it's like something has kind of, you know, what they learn in the first year of life has stuck.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
So I think experience definitely does have an impact. But going back to the training yourself to perceive sounds in a new language, one thing that's interesting is that it's something that everyone can do. Maybe people will have different experiences. You know, so some people, there's always going to be variations if you have a bunch of people do an experiment, but it's something that there have been so many different experiments done on it, and it's quite a robust effect. So I think that's really interesting in terms of, so the brain can still learn, maybe not perfectly, but you can definitely learn to hear sounds in a second language.
Mm-hmm. Cool. I have a selfish question.
Go for it.
Because it seems like I have a phonetics background in the sense of, I understand a lot of the IPA, the phonetic alphabet. I understand how sounds are made. I understand a lot of vocabulary around it. What I don't have a background in is like how the brain works with phonetics. And it seems like you have a little bit more than I do. So I have a selfish question. You may or may not have the answer to it. I remember the first time I took a phonetics class, or rather I did phonetics, period, was in a linguistics class when I was about 18 years old back in university. And I took linguistics at the time because I'd learned French really well. I'd been to France. I liked it after going to France. I learned Spanish. I like Spanish. I thought maybe I'll like languages, so let's take a linguistics class. Most of linguistics was mildly interesting, quite interesting. And then phonetics, the phonetics unit came around, and it was the easiest thing I've ever done in my life for me. I would walk into it, first the alphabet required some studying, like what does everything say? But hearing the sounds required no effort. If we had a test, our tests would be impossible to study for, because our teacher or professor would just play an audio. We had to write what we heard in a phonetic alphabet. And it was a joke. Like, it was, for me, it would be literally, I'd go, they'd play it, I'd be done in 10 minutes. Right? Like, I'd be in and out, 98%, 99%. Usually I'd be like, I miswrote one letter, like something silly. But it was the easiest thing in the world. I was like, wow, is this what it feels like for the gifted math kids in school, where they just walk in and they just don't have to think, and it's like, holy man. And it was so cool. Unfortunately, there's only one unit. And unfortunately, phonetics, as you study it more, I realized there's more graphs and it gets really technical. And I didn't like it. So I did take more phonetics. And I was like, spectrograms, oh my God, shoot me now. I hate this. This is like back in math class. I can't do this. So I didn't do it. But I guess I'm wondering why, if you know the answer, why would that happen? Like, I actually don't know. Like, how does that happen?
I think it's certainly possible that if, you know, were most of the people you studied with monolingual?
I have no idea. I think no. I don't think so. Yeah, I don't think so. Some were, obviously, but we're in Canada, so it's probably not.
Yeah, of course. Because I wonder whether, but you do have more experience learning languages possibly than most of the other people in the class, or is that not necessarily true?
I don't actually know, but even even like for French, when I was 15,
Yeah.
went to France for 3 months. A bunch of us went on a 3-month exchange trip to different parts of France. So we weren't together, but everyone was in France for the same period of time. We left on the same day, came back on the same day. Everyone was the same age. Most people had the same amount of experience in French. Some people had a little less, but generally speaking, about the same experience. And I remember coming back and like when I was in France, to hear the differences of what I was saying and what others were saying, and accent differences and what I like, and to be able to fix things came very natural to me. I had a friend who was also quite good at giving me analogies to help, but generally it was quite natural. So when I came back, I spoke without an accent, no French accent. You would not know if I was French or not. But not everyone was able to do it. And so I guess selfishly, I'm just wondering if there's like a brain thing, if it's brain development, if it's genetics, if it's like there's like if it developed early on. Like I'm just really curious if you happen to know how that can happen.
I think there's lots of reasons that could happen for, and it's not necessary. It could be genetic. I'm not sure what the research is on kind of genetic sensibility to sound differences and how long people, maybe there are differences between how long people are able to perceive differences between sounds that aren't in their native language, or maybe some people maintain some of that for longer. But I think it could also certainly be due to experience as well. And one thing that I think is interesting is also identity.
Okay.
So,
what do you mean?
So, for example, something that I notice with my students is I have students who, well, I'll go first with experience and then I'll talk about identity.
Got it.
So first, experience. I think part of learning a foreign accent, a big part of learning a foreign accent is actually just deciding to do it and then paying attention. So often people just think, oh, I'll never be able to have a French accent. I'm English, so I'll just always have an English accent when I speak French. And so they never, they study the grammar, they study the vocabulary, and they never actually put the effort in to train their mouth muscles to pronounce something in a different way or to perceive it differently. So to listen and say, okay, so I know that these two words are different. I know that French people. Oh,
you froze for a second, but you're back.
Okay. So to kind of put that effort in and put that focus in of saying, okay, I know these two words are different, so I'm going to actually really focus on them and put my attention there and try and figure out what it is. So I think maybe a lot of people don't necessarily do that. So they just say like, oh, I'd like to improve my accent, but they don't do the practical steps that they need to do to improve it. So that's in terms of experience.
So I guess you're saying like some people put in effort, some people don't, essentially.
Yeah, and some people maybe think that they are, but they're not doing the specific steps that they need to do. So some people just kind of think, oh, I'd like to improve my accent, but they don't actually.
That sounds like in reproduction, though, like in your mouth. How about the ears? Like, how does that work?
But I think it applies to perception as well. So for example, I could say, oh, I'd love to be able to pronounce the difference between, or I'd love to be able to perceive, the difference between, for example, the double letters in Italian that I was talking about before.
Yes. Like pala and whatever it was.
Pala.
Yeah. Pala. Yeah.
So I'd love to be able to perceive that difference. But then they don't really go the extra step, which is maybe talking to your friends, saying, okay, say spade again. Okay. Now say ball again. So to actually, and to know that difference is there and to be constantly paying attention to it as you're listening. So I think that's one thing that everyone can do. And it might be something that you did naturally that other people didn't.
So is that a thing? That's what I'm just going to ask, like just for my own, I guess my own research through you is that I'm assuming that's a thing where some people will find it easier than others. Like I'm assuming, or like
absolutely
that's a thing. Okay.
Yeah. That's for sure. We definitely know that. The question mark is why, and I think there's lots of potential reasons why.
Interesting.
Coming on to identity, I've noticed between students, so Italian students who are learning English, I can have students who two different students who both do the experience part. Maybe we do it together. So they tell me that they want to improve their accent. So we start working together in the lessons on perceiving the difference between, I'm just thinking of all the rude words now that are difficult to pronounce in English. You know, like the beach and the sheet.
Oh, is that a thing that happens in Italian too? They struggle with those too? Oh, interesting. So it's not just los Latinos.
Yeah. So, and we will actually do lessons where we practice the difference between those. So both listening and, or, you know, more of a more appropriate example, the difference between 13 and 30.
Okay.
Which seems really obvious, but actually it's not. If you don't have native speaker English ears, the difference is really, really subtle. So we'll do exercises where we practice it both for perception, so listen and write the number, and like kind of repeat after me. Let's get the mouth moving in the right position. And I noticed that there's a difference, but some of my students really take it on and start using it in their kind of daily lives, and you can tell that they're really committed to practicing it and to using it and to taking it on, not just when we're in the lesson, but to communicate in that way. So to change their accent essentially when they speak.
Right.
Whereas other students say that they want to change their accent, but I notice a lot of resistance in terms of identity. And even with, so Mateo once said to me, so he'll kind of speak and he'll say the instead of the. So like,
yep.
I'm
going to say that again? I think I don't know if everyone would have caught that.
And so he'll say the instead of the. So like, I'm going to the shops.
Yep.
And then I know that he wants to improve his accent. Although, you know, if he was happy, there's absolutely nothing wrong with an Italian accent, so I wouldn't hassle him for it. But I know that he wants to improve. So I say, you're going to, huh? And then he'll say with this perfect accent, the shops. And then I say, well, if you can do it perfectly, why don't you do it? And he says, because I feel stupid.
Right.
And I think that some people really struggle with that in the fact that I guess it comes back to what we were talking about before in terms of acting a little bit.
Totally.
And identity. So for some people are really, you know, they feel embarrassed. They don't feel comfortable. They've got this is how I speak. This is how I speak in Italian, and I'm just going to speak the same way that I speak in English. Otherwise, I'll feel stupid.
Yeah, or this is the way to speak, regardless of language. This is what is correct. Everything else sounds funny, even though someone else's ears. What you think is normal might sound maybe not funny, but you know, not natural or not their version of what the right way to speak is. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, and I wonder, I think that could also have maybe affected, maybe not necessarily in the phonetics exam, but certainly your experience in France. You know, there are more, maybe the people who struggled with accents, maybe they didn't kind of let themselves get into it as much. Maybe they had kind of some issues in terms of identity and feeling stupid by taking on a new accent. Interesting. I've never, and it's interesting. I wonder if like someone who's very passive, and passive in the sense of like a people pleaser. I'm not a people pleaser, but someone who cares about how people view them, or maybe who doesn't want to cause any problems, let's say, right? That's kind of more inherent in their nature. Like I wonder if they would be more receptive to something like that because they don't want to, they don't want to inconvenience others, or I wonder if it's a personality trait. Like, I don't know. Yeah, I think to a certain extent it is, because I notice, I think it comes down to confidence as well sometimes. Like, but my students who are more, it comes down to confidence and also the growth mentality in terms of learning. So the students that I have who are, they don't get stuck so much in the brain loop of like, oh no, I'm bad at English, I'll never learn this, blah, blah, blah. They're the ones who just listen and kind of plod along. So they'll learn, then they apply it, then they learn more without asking themselves all of these kind of psychological questions.
are the ones who eventually, the ones who are more confident as well. I think maybe you have to be quite confident to do that. And also the ones who tend to end up with a better accent. Whereas the ones who are really shy and you can tell they've got a lot of, I mean, learning a language is like this. As sometimes I feel like part of my job as a teacher is not just to teach a language, but also to try and remove some of the psychological barriers and psychological issues people have when it comes to learning a language. And the ones that are shyer and tend to have, they're very, very, very in their head, and they're telling themselves that they're no good, and
that's common, I think, for like any skill, right? Like it's like if I were to take anything that requires gross motor skills, surfing, like many sports that I've never done before, dance, like those kinds of things, like I would be like, I'm not good at gross motor activities in general. So like number one, I'd be at a lower point than most people going in. And then I'm also be super conscious. So I like almost need, like personally, I would almost need a teacher that has a lot of empathy.
Yeah.
And is able to like, you know, almost like work with me on both the skills, but also like the mental side of it.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think you're right. It's something that can be applied to any skill. I think often, this is a bit trite, but I think it's true that often when it comes to learning new skills, people get in their own ways a lot. Like I know I do. When it, you know, I'm so in my head, I'm thinking of all the reasons I can't do something, and that definitely makes life more difficult for me. Rather than now, I'm trying a lot. So anything new, for example, with the website now, I'm having to learn a lot of new stuff about online marketing and SEO and websites as well. And I know that I don't have a growth mentality when it comes to that stuff naturally. I kind of think, oh, this isn't my kind of thing. And I'm having to try and train myself to just stop asking questions and having a continuous analysis going on in my brain about whether I'm good at it, how bad I am, what's going wrong, and just be like, okay, shut up, just do the next step.
For sure.
And I think that learning a language is very much like that.
Definitely. Well, I think we can wrap it up. We've been going for, I'm not sure how long. Good chunk of time.
Yeah, good chat.
So, well, thanks for your time, everyone. If you are, I forget what I was going to say. Well, I had something I was going to say and it went
brains fried.
Completely fried. So, so Katie, where can people find you online?
So people can find me on my website. So it's joyoflanguages.com. On social media, so Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, the handle is @joyoflanguages. And YouTube as well, @Joy of Languages.
Joy of Languages, cool. So like JOY of Languages.
Yes, exactly.
Awesome. Yeah. Okay, well, let's wrap it up.
Thank you for having me on.
Sounds good. Talk to you later.
Bye.